Welcome to learning how to use manual exposure settings on your digital camera. This video is brought to you by freephotocourse.com. Visit our website for in-depth lessons, tips, how-tos, our discount camera and photo gear store, and much more. freephotocourse.com. You too can compose amazing images using secrets the pros know and use. This lesson is geared to people with digital point-and-shoot or digital SLR cameras that have manual exposure controls. We think about the words f-stop, ISO, and shutter speed. Frankly, most people get very confused by these terms. They all have to do with exposure, and exposure refers to how bright or dark the image appears. So an image that's overexposed had too much light and is too bright. An image that is underexposed had too little light and appears too dark. An example here of Space Shuttle Discovery sitting on the pad. At the correct exposure, you can see a lot of detail, nice rich color, and a fair amount of depth. When it's underexposed, not enough light got into the camera, and as a result it's primarily shadowed. Colors are lost in the shadows, and so is the detail. With overexposure, the color is also muted, and there's a general haziness. Obviously, very little contrast or difference between light and dark. Again, the correct exposure really has the best of both worlds. You have a lot of color and clarity, and you see the detail. So what four factors influence exposure? Amount of light, ISO, aperture, which is related to that term f-stop, and shutter speed. A good place to start is to understand what ISO is all about. It stands for International Organization for Standardization. ISO numbers denote the degree to which a camera's CMOS or CCD chip is sensitive to light. So what it's really all about is how much a camera is going to respond to a given amount of light. ISO numbers generally range from 100 all the way to 6500 in some expensive cameras. Just remember that a low ISO number equates to low light sensitivity, and a high ISO number means that the camera is going to be even more sensitive to that same amount of light. So the ISO number is something that can be changed and manipulated. An ISO rating of 100-200 is ideal for shooting outside on bright, sunny days, while an ISO of 400 is called a general purpose ISO, and it's great for indoor with a flash or outdoor shooting. Gives the photographer a great deal of flexibility. ISOs of 800 or 1000 are good for low light situations such as indoor without a flash, outdoors in the evening, or concerts. Now, if you're planning to shoot in a very low light situation without a flash, you'll need a very high ISO number, such as 1600, or if your camera supports it, even higher than that. The other thing is, if you're shooting very fast moving objects, your camera's going to want to use a high shutter speed, and that's going to freeze that fast moving object. But since the shutter's open for a very short amount of time, very little light gets in, so you want the camera to be more sensitive. This is how it works. Low numbers, you need more light for a proper exposure. High number ISOs, you'll need less light, again, to make that proper exposure. So you may be tempted to say, why don't we just set our camera's ISO to 3600 and leave it at that? It'll be more flexible and obviously more sensitive to light. The problem is that it may be too sensitive to light. The other problem is that it's going to produce photos which are going to be noisier or grainier or have worse pixelization. You see, at lower ISO settings, although the camera is not going to be as sensitive to light, the photos are going to be a better quality. Less pixelization, less grain, less noise, and generally clearer photos. So in this example image, the camera's ISO was set to 100. The result is a very sharp image with no noise or grain, and even when cropped tightly, the pixels are not an issue. The image is as sharp as it can be. Now, by contrast, we took another shot of the same scene with the camera's ISO set to 1600. Well, the result is a very pixelated and noisy image, and when cropped tight, you can see the pixels become an issue and definitely affect the overall clarity. Now, the next two important concepts to learn when it comes to exposure control are that of aperture and f-stop. An aperture is a variable opening or hole in the lens that gets wider or narrower to let more or less light in. Now the f-stop, those are numbers that are assigned to the specific aperture sizes. So consider that various sized holes have their own f-stop number, and this is standardized, so we know that whatever camera we're looking at, whatever lens we're looking through, an f-stop that has a certain number is going to have the same sized hole. Now, what's the diaphragm? Well, the diaphragm is the thing that actually makes that hole or aperture. The diaphragm is a set of interlapping metal leaves in the lens that opens and closes to make a bigger or smaller hole. Now, f-stop ranges go from, at a low area, 1.8 all the way up to 22. And I know if you're looking at your own camera, you may say, gee, my f-stop numbers only go from 2 to, let's say, 8. And if that's the case, you're probably looking at a point-and-shoot camera. If you have a digital SLR camera with interchangeable lenses, you're going to find a greater range of f-stop numbers. Now, what does it all mean? As you can see in this illustration, the lower f-stop numbers have larger holes and they let more light get into the camera. The smaller f-stop numbers, let's say for instance 22, it's really closed up and much less light gets into the camera. We think about the diaphragm, these overlapping leaves creating that hole through which light can pass, and we understand that the diaphragm's leaves open and close to create various aperture sizes. More or less light enters through this hole in the lens. An f-stop of 2 means it's a large hole. Lots of light gets into the camera. An f-stop of 22, it's a tiny hole. A little light, not very much light, gets into the camera. The next very important element of exposure control is shutter speed. And shutter speed is all about how long light is allowed to enter the camera. And shutter speeds are presented in whole numbers, but they're really fractions of a second. 60 is the most common shutter speed, and that means that the shutters open for 1/60th of a second. And these are very precise times. The most commonly used shutter speeds range from 30 to 4,000. Now remember, these are all fractions of a second, and they're all very fast. Obviously, 1/4000th of a second is an incredibly short amount of time. It's such a short amount of time, it is capable of freezing very fast-moving objects. 1/30th of a second is still a fast amount of time, but speaking photographically, it's a much slower exposure than would be 1/4000th of a second. When we talk about a shutter's ability to freeze objects so that they appear clear, although a shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second did a fine job of freezing these very fast-moving planes, slower shutter speeds of 1/90th of a second or 1/60th of a second don't come close to doing the job. In order to freeze the motion of this jet flying just shy of supersonic speed, a shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second was necessary. But shutter speed isn't merely about freezing or showing motion. It's also about how much light gets into the camera, and that, of course, affects exposure. The longer the shutter is open, the more aggregate light gets into the camera, and the shorter the shutter speed, the less light gets in. Think about this analogy. If a person burns easily in the strong midday rays of the summer sun, it's easy to see how the duration of light exposure has a cumulative effect. That person will not burn in 15 minutes of exposure to the sun, but the cumulative effect of 4 hours of sunlight will certainly be felt and seen. The CCD or CMOS of a digital camera is the image and light sensor, and in a sense, it's like your skin. The longer it's exposed to light, the brighter the exposure. The only difference is that it doesn't take hours to see the difference. In fact, shooting at 1/30th of a second, at 1/90th of a second, and again at 1/500th of a second can make a huge difference in the resulting exposure. One can appear perfect, and the others could be way too bright or too dark. There's no perfect number. How shutter speed affects exposure also depends on the amount of light when the shot is taken, the f-stop, and the ISO setting. We hope this lesson helps you to better understand the basics of manual exposure control. Look for part 2 of this video that explores how to read and use your camera's light meter to properly set shutter speed, ISO, and f-stops. Make sure to visit one of the web's most helpful yet totally free photo learning websites, freephotocourse.com. In-depth photography lessons, pro secrets and tips, step-by-step how-tos, a contributors gallery, photography forum, discount camera store, and much more. freephotocourse.com. You too can create stunning images like the pros.